אברהם, בניה, בא לכם את השיר ביחד, בואו בואו. שיר למעלות, אשא עיניי אל ההרים, מאין יבוא עזרי, עזרי מאימה שעושה שמיים וארץ, אל יתן אמות רגליך, אל ינום שומרך,
הנה לא ינום ולא יישן שומר ישראל, השם שומרך, השם צילך, על יד ימינך.
יומם השמש לא יככה, וירח בלילה, השם ישמורך מכל רע, ישמור את נפשך, השם ישמור צאתך ובואך, מעתה ועד עולם, מעתה ועד עולם. שיר למעלה, אשא עיניי אל ההרים, מאין יבוא עזרי, עזרי מאימה שעושה שמיים וארץ, אל יתן למות רגליך, אל ינום שומרך, הנה לא ינום ולא יישן שומר ישראל, השם שומרך, השם צילך, על יד ימינך. יומם
ברוכים הבאים. So glad to have you with us as Yom Yerushalayim is drawn to a close on the East Coast. On behalf of Ivrit Bamerkaz, Hebrew at the Center, I want to welcome you to Sicha, a series of online conversations focused on Hebrew. My name is Arnie Winchell, and I am the founding president of Ivrit Bamerkaz. Ivrit Bamerkaz was founded over 10 years ago with the mission to revolutionize the teaching and learning of Hebrew. We chose this focus in service of a vision of a world where Hebrew literacy is vibrant, celebrated, and pivotal to a thriving Jewish identity and global Jewish community. When we set out as a small group of Hebrew language educators and enthusiasts to disrupt the status quo, we envisioned that our contribution to this Salon, this dream, would be realized by addressing what has been a lack of success in effectively giving the gift of proficiency in Hebrew to Jews throughout the diaspora. We believe that through a deep investment in our educators and educational system to ensure effective and engaging Hebrew teaching and learning, we will see a Jewish world in which modern Hebrew is not only the language of the state of Israel, Medinat Yisrael, but also the language of Am Yisrael, the people of Israel. Through Sicha, we are hoping to engage a wider audience in appreciating the value of investing in Hebrew and in joining us to disrupt the status quo. We will be holding one more Sicha, one more conversation in the current series on Sunday, May 31st. Please check our website for details, hebrew@thecenter.org. Now I want to welcome our conversants. We're privileged to have Nancy Berg and Melissa Weinberg in a Sicha conversation about Hebrew culture and identity. Nancy is a professor of Hebrew and comparative literature at Washington University in St. Louis and a past president of the National Association of Professors of Hebrew. Nancy and Naomi Sokoloff edited a volume that was the winner of the National Jewish Book Award for anthologies and collections. We talk about what we talk about when we talk about Hebrew and what it means to Americans. And she also has a forthcoming book, Since 1948, Israeli Literature in the Making. Melissa Weininger is the Anna Smith Fine Lecturer in Jewish Studies and the Associate Director of the Program in Jewish Studies at Rice University. She has a PhD in Jewish Studies from the University of Chicago and an undergraduate degree from Harvard University. She teaches courses on Jewish literature and film, gender, and Israel. I now want to introduce Rabbi Andrew Ergis, the new CEO of Hebrew at the Center, who will moderate this series. For more than 20 years, Rabbi Ergis has held leadership roles across the spectrum of Jewish education, from Jewish camp to day school to JCCs and more. He has demonstrated his own personal passion for Hebrew, not only through his professional life and graduate work in Hebrew language and literature, but also in his personal life. For the past 3 years, he's been the chair of the board of the Council for Hebrew Language and Culture in North America. Andrew?
Arnie, thank you so much, and thank you everyone who's joining us this evening. We're going to start our conversation really in trialogue, but I want to call your attention to the question and answer function at the bottom of your screen. Certainly feel free to post questions. And after Melissa and Nancy and I have had an opportunity to start a conversation and begin to surface some questions, we'll shift to include your questions as well, so that we can, as much as possible, make this a real Sicha, a real conversation. But I want to turn to you, Nancy and Melissa. First of all, thank you so much for joining us here at Hebrew at the Center with our Sicha program. And I'd love to start by just hearing, first you, Melissa, and then you, Nancy. What was your Hebrew journey?
Me first? Okay.
Sure.
Well, maybe like a lot of people, certainly in my field, I think, I went to a Jewish day school where I learned Hebrew, and then at some point, and I guess I never really stopped learning Hebrew, and then at some point, I realized it was a thing that you could actually study and, think about more deeply, and not sure that I have like a moment or a particular story, but it's certainly, I guess, always been part of my life or the background of my, and then, when I went to college, and then afterward I spent some time in Israel, I realized it was something that, could be more of a focus for me.
Nancy, did you have a similar arc, or did it take some different directions?
Well, I did not go to a day school, and in fact, when I started, I guess, really learning Hebrew at the Prose Door of Hebrew College, and when I took the placement exam, I think I placed so low, and also the head of the Prose Door at the time told me that they didn't usually take people of my background, but he would let me in. He just wanted me to know I wouldn't finish, that I had no chance of completing the program. So in the best spirit of Davka, I think, I think that was the only thing that kept me in. So, and then I went to the University of Michigan and I got to study with the wonderful Edna Coffin. And, as they say, the rest is history.
I really, really appreciate the irony of someone who just so low, has no future in the prose door, and is now a professor of Hebrew literature. I'm curious, I know both of you really made the shift to make this your central to your professional lives. I'm wondering how the two of you first came to know one another, and if there were things that drew you to one another because there were similarities, and then were there things that were just really, really different about how you thought about Hebrew and Hebrew literature?
Well, we met at a conference. Ironically, it was about Israeli literature in other languages other than Hebrew. And I was immediately drawn to Melissa because of the talk she gave that I thought was just quite wonderful.
Well, and then I think that we did have a lot in common in terms of what we were interested in. We were both writing about and talking about Israeli literature written in English at that time. Our papers overlapped a little bit. And I think maybe we had a lot in common too, in terms of how we thought about the field, I think. Mm-hmm. I would say. I'm not exactly sure I can put my finger on what that is, but I feel like we had some common feeling about it.
What I find is almost every time I read something that Melissa has written or go to a talk, I think, oh, I wish I had done that, or I was going to work on that, or this resonates in a different way. And I appreciate that, even though we have very different, we come from very different directions to our study. So.
I know, Nancy, I came across you and your work when I encountered the wonderful book that you co-authored, What We Talk About When We Talk About Hebrew, and what it means for Americans. And I recall reading early on, probably in the introduction, about sort of the unique situation of being a non-native speaker in a field that's really been populated by Israelis and Israeli Americans. I'm curious if that was another thing that drew you one to the other, and what's that experience is, lived experience is like for each of you, being specialists in a literature of a language that is not necessarily your native tongue.
Well, and I think, for one hand, Hebrew literature, modern Hebrew literature, was created by people for whom Hebrew was not their native tongue, for the most part. But it can be a challenge. I don't always know family relations between different people. The Israelis are always up on the gossip and the background, the backstory. But I find that also doesn't distract me. And sometimes we can hear things that the Israelis don't hear because they're so used to the language that they don't hear why this is a strange locution, or that this has the rhythms of perhaps a New England poet. Melissa?
Well, I mean, I have two thoughts about this. One is, I think it's a weird question that only gets asked of people who study Hebrew literature. For the most part, I mean, it's very common in comparative literature for people to study literatures that are not in their native language. So I sort of am curious about what the fact that question gets asked a lot, and even, I mean, gets asked so much that Nancy and Naomi put together a whole book about it, precisely because there's something there that needs to be answered, right? If not the question itself, then whatever's behind the question. And so I think that's kind of interesting, because so on one hand, my answer to your question is I don't know, I guess it just feels like anyone who studies a literature that's not their own. I mean, I also, you know, Nancy also works on Arabic, and I also work on Yiddish, and a little bit of German, and sometimes I do also work on literature written in English, but I don't think I've ever been asked that question about another literature. You know, I don't know if that's true for you, Nancy. Is it true that have you ever been asked that about Arabic?
Well, when I first started out, there were not very many people who were, first of all, Arabic literature wasn't a blossoming field.
Right.
Talking quite a while ago. But also I remember my first Arabic class that it was like, are you Arab? No. Oh, so your boyfriend's Arab? No. You know, it was that sort of like, why would you be taking this language if you don't have a personal connection to it?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you're right. It does get asked in various ways about other literatures too, and other, you know, fields. I know I have a lot of colleagues in religious studies, and, you know, for example, non-Jewish scholars of religious studies or Jewish studies get asked these questions a lot. And I think also, say, Jewish scholars of, you know, Christianity get asked that a lot too. So I know there's a kind of interest there, but I do think there's a kind of particular interest with it with regard to Hebrew literature. And I wonder why. I'm not sure. I mean, I don't think I have an answer to that question, but I think it's an interesting question about why it's so important to people to know that. And I do think it has something to do with diaspora and the way that Zionism has constructed the diaspora. And then, but the other thing I would say about it that makes it a funny question to me sometimes is that if you're in the field of Hebrew literature, one thing you know is that, I mean, really most of the best scholarship, or I would say the most dynamic scholarship, largest volume of scholarship maybe even, is about Hebrew literature, is produced in the United States. Some of it is by Israeli scholars who live here, but a lot of it isn't. And so, you know, I think in a way I think that's not, you know, Israel looms so large that sometimes I think people forget that there is this sort of big interest in and study of, you know, Hebrew literature in the US, more and more in Europe too, I would say, but definitely here.
Well, I think also that the non-Israelis have been able to look more at the margins until recently, that Israelis were trained so well in high school and college to think of Hebrew literature in a certain way and Israeli literature in a certain way, that they didn't look at, you know, my field is the Mizrahim, the Jews from Arab and Islamic lands. They didn't look at them, those writers, or it took a while to look at the American Hebrew writers.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, that's also like what Hannah Kronfeld's book is, The Margins of Modernism, is about, in a way, is the way that, you know, exactly like a certain Israeli way of thinking about looking at Hebrew literature has constructed our conceptions of it, the boundaries of it. And I've had even, you know, Israelis, especially who are trained in Israel, say to me that there is a kind of freedom that you have not coming from that system to think about things a little bit differently. There's sometimes less restraints or restrictions, or just there's a, you know, not such a rigid way of thinking about particular kinds of texts or periodizations or things like that. Yeah,
I think so. I agree.
I'm curious. You suggested that if not the quality, the volume, or quality and volume of writing and thinking about this is happening here in the United States, but the actual production of Hebrew literature in the United States is really quite small. I know there was a fairly rich Tarbut Ivrit culture in the first half of the 20th century here in America. Like, what happened and why are we spending a lot of time and resources studying it and talking about it, but not actually producing it?
Hebrew literature in the United States?
Yeah.
Well, the state of Israel happened. I guess that's maybe that's like the short answer. I don't know if Nancy has another answer.
Well, I think if we're going to look at Tarbut Ivrit, for one thing, we do have a continuation that when we were putting together this volume, I recognized at this conference we had that started the volume of what we talk about when we talk about Hebrew, that nearly everybody who was involved was a product of the Tarbut Ivrit movement, whether it was direct or indirectly. And so that we continue that legacy, but it has become something very, very different. Tarbut Ivrit movement started as a pretty much, according to Alan Mintz, as an elitist movement. It really wasn't meant to teach Hebrew to everyone. And today we might have the feeling that, oh, well, we want everyone to learn Hebrew, and I certainly do. But we haven't, I think the more, perhaps we're not quite as good at it if we're trying to reach more people. It gets diluted in a way. But we still have institutions that are Tarbut Ivrit institutions are still going strong. They're just very different because things have life cycles and things change.
I want to go back to the very short answer that Melissa, that you gave. And I'd like to unpack that just a little more. When you say, well, what came along was Israel, is it that the center of this kind of work shifted, or that the simultaneous revitalization of Hebrew as a spoken language had impact on sort of the writing of Hebrew literature? Like,
I mean, that's sort of a glib answer. So
well, you're allowed to make glib at.
Yeah, no, I mean, I guess, I mean, to go back actually to pick up on what Nancy ended on just now, I mean, I think it's important to, I think sometimes what happens is this kind of nostalgia for, you know, for example, for the Tarbut Ivrit movement, or for some, you know, unspecified period when Jewish literacy in the United States was better or something like that. And I think, like Nancy said, it's important to remember that there's not some like fixed moment in time when all of these things were different or better, but that they keep changing. I mean, I'm reading right now a new book by Sheila Jelen called Salvage Poetics, that's about the way that certain writers in the post-Holocaust era sort of used Jewish texts, especially Yiddish texts, as a kind of folk ethnography of, you know, a culture that had disappeared, and a way to translate it to an American readership. And there's this incredible nostalgia that's actually constructed for things that didn't exist, like the shtetl, you know, as it's conceived of, you know, in Shalom Aleichem, right? He made that up, like it's fictional. It was created for a literary purpose. But the way that certain emblems got picked up, you know, in the post-Holocaust era in the United States, when there was a kind of mourning or loss, you know, people were experiencing the loss of that culture, those things got picked up as these cultural touchstones and sort of crafted into, retroactively, you know, into memory. And so I guess what I'm saying is I think it's important for us to try not to do that, and maybe rather than like ask the question, what happened to that, as in we're mourning that, there's something lost there, think about that more as like, you know, one period in a culture's development or evolution. You know, there are very different and interesting political, social, cultural circumstances at work now. including, you know, forces of globalization, all kinds of things that didn't operate or exist in the same way in, you know, the pre-state era or in the period of the Tarhuti Freed movement. And so, you know, I think it's maybe more useful, or I'm more interested in thinking about, okay, well, what does this moment have to offer us? Also, like Nancy said, how is it related to those things, or how are these a product of that period? How can we draw lines or connections between that period and this period? But there's so many interesting things going on now. I mean, you said, you know, there's very little Hebrew literature being produced in the United States, and that's true, and it's of a very different kind, but it's really interesting. And I think there will be more of it. And it's also linked to literature that's being produced in Europe and Israel. And, you know, those connections, those filaments in like an increasingly globalized world, until we all had to lock ourselves in our houses, are really interesting to think about, I think.
And there are Israelis who are producing their Hebrew literature here in the United States, as Melissa was alluding to, so that there is actually perhaps not less, it's perhaps the same amount of Hebrew literature is being generated, and at a really high quality.
Yeah, and different types too. And yeah. And I think against certain kinds of different kinds of cultural expectations and political expectations and all kinds of things.
I know place and time obviously play a critical role in a language and in a literature. And as we're interested in Hebrew and Hebrew literature, I'd be interested in first going back and then maybe going forward. Going back, I know, Melissa, your work's more on the sort of European creativity, and that Nancy's work is more in the Middle Eastern community. How did Hebrew, both the language and the literature, differ in those cultural contexts, both in terms of place and time?
Do you want me to start, Nancy, for
Sure, that's a huge question.
I don't know. We're back at your first conference, and you're just discussing each other's papers.
I think we were actually discussing what we were going to eat for dinner, but that's always a very important topic of conversation when Nancy and I get together. But so I think what you're referring to is that my sort of approach or background is grounded in this study of like the European origins of Hebrew literature and its relationship to Yiddish and other European languages. And of course, Nancy's is grounded in the Jews from Arab lands who immigrated to Israel and produced Hebrew literature. And I mean, I think for both of us, and Nancy can confirm or contradict as she wishes, but I think, you know, the thing that we have in common is that I think we're both very interested in thinking about, and maybe this goes back to something Nancy said earlier about the study of Hebrew literature in the United States, in thinking about pushing out or through the boundaries of Hebrew literature as it has often been construed, say, in Zionist literary histories, and you know, thinking about it through the lens of other languages and literatures and cultures that have sometimes been buried or suppressed in it. I don't know, Nancy, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that many of the Jews from Arab lands. And I would use the phrase Arab Jew, but I understand that for some people that's controversial. But these Jews who have Arabic as their mother tongues and as their main mode of consuming and producing culture come from a different background that is lively and exciting, and it comes through into their Hebrew, even for writers such as Shimon Balas, who for several years denied himself listening to and reading Hebrew when he was trying to make himself into a Hebrew author. And some of them have worked very hard to remove this, and yet I'm going to go back to Shimon Balas again. He opened his first novel with a phrase in Arabic. And so even as those who switched to Hebrew, even those who wanted to become Hebrew writers, were very much trained in Arabic and in Arabic literature and in Arabic literature. Sami Michael has said, "Oh, this was a horrible background, horrible training for a Hebrew writer." He doesn't mean that the Arabic culture wasn't important and significant. What he does mean is that it wasn't held dearly by the Hebrew culture of the time. And today I think that Hebrew is much more generous and welcoming, and Israeli culture is starting at least to allow these different voices in and these different modes. And
although I think that's partly due to the kind of work that you just mentioned. Like it was due to, and obviously that's ongoing, now there's a lot of like very conscious and very political, also politico-literary, however you want to think of it, right, work being done in that. But if you think about that line of Arabic as doing some kind of, work that it's knocking on the door or kicking on the door or whatever, of the gatekeepers of Hebrew, I think.
But even way back to say Brenner, he used Arabic when Hebrew didn't have enough different registers, or the Hebrew that was being used at the time. He used Arabic to express slang.
Yeah, although it was more often those writers used Yiddish, or not right. Yiddish, but they would basically use Yiddish forms and right. Idioms that they then imported translated into Hebrew, because there wasn't a great way to write dialogue in Hebrew because nobody spoke it.
Right. And that goes to another point that, Andrew, we were talking about before, which was sort of the connection between spoken Hebrew and written Hebrew, right? That unlike almost any other language that I know of, modern Hebrew today, the spoken language came from the written. Every other language that I know of developed spoken to written. There are languages that today are just now getting orthographies and ways of writing them down. And Hebrew, modern Hebrew, was written by people who didn't necessarily speak it. And then they had to sort of work backwards to create speech. And that's just fascinating. And today, the written Hebrew, especially the Ktivat Razah, or the spare writing, is trying to mimic speech patterns, oral speech patterns, and bring that back into the written. To me, that's one of the most exciting things about Hebrew. So, I don't know, Melissa, if you have something that...
No, I was thinking about what you just said, that, I often think about this, that, when, for example, like Abramovich wanted to rewrite his novels or novellas, whatever you want to call them, in Hebrew, his Yiddish novels. yeah, I mean, he was basically writing. I mean, it's such an interesting thought experiment, right? He was writing these characters who were speaking to each other in a language that people didn't speak. Right. There's a kind of like, you know, it existed in this kind of bubble, and that became the basis for spoken language. But again, he was importing, you know.
Right. But we have an interesting parallel in Arabic, where Arabic literature used to be written only in literary Arabic. People would speak the dialect, but when they went to write even dialogue, they would write it in very formal, stiff, classical literary Arabic. And so you can do a study with looking at the ways that this was done in Arabic and that the ways this was done in Hebrew. Yiddish doesn't have that.
Right. But it's a little,
Yiddish is, you know, we think of Yiddish as a very juicy language, right? And very expressive.
Well, Yiddish is sort of the opposite in a way, because it was primarily a vernacular language, right? And
exactly.
Early modern writers of Yiddish literature had to sort of make a claim for its
literariness,
right. You know, authenticity or legitimacy, let's say, right?
Whereas Hebrew was legitimate, but it was so stodgy at first and so limited.
It was, yeah, it was intellectually, literarily legitimated. Yeah, absolutely. And of course, that's all tied to gender too, which is another whole.
That's a whole other question.
Conversation or.
Yeah. I do want to, first of all, we'll keep going, but I see some people have started posting questions, and we want to encourage everyone else who hears something that's particularly interesting. If I do want to remind you that if it's about a particular thing either Nancy or Melissa said, it'd be helpful for you to also indicate what it was that you're reacting to. Because you both, you work with multiple languages, you teach literature, I'd be really, you know, what's your thinking about, first of all, translation? Most people are accessing these texts, don't have the language resources to read in the original. And I'm curious in particular with the flourishing of so much Hebrew literature, whether it's classic or contemporary, is now available in translation. Is that good or bad for those of us who would like to see growth in spoken Hebrew in North America?
I think it's great. I think it's, you know, it's the gateway. It's sort of an opening. If you read these wonderful novels and they're still wonderful in translation, and some of the translations are very good, and you read them in translation, that might entice you to get to know the language better and learn it so that you could read it in the original. Because we all know something else, it's a different text once it is translated. And I know I'm not going to go with the Bialik line that, you know, translation, reading poetry in translation is like kissing your mother or your lover through a veil. There's some wonderful lines about how translation is not any good. But translation today is a field of study unto its own that is just so marvelous and so, I don't know, I think wondrous. And I think, fine, read it in translation, but then maybe you're going to want to learn the language because it's not always the same text. I mean, there are even books that have chapters that aren't translated. The Oz wonderful masterpiece, The Tale of Love and Darkness. One of those chapters isn't in the translation. Or Hillel Halkan, who was he's translated Agnon. I heard him say at a conference, sometimes he'd get to a really difficult passage and he'd choose to skip it. Now, You know, so you're going to miss something, and you miss a lot of the associative richness that Hebrew has. But so what? It's better to read it in translation than not read it at all. Melissa?
Yeah, I mean, you know, there's so little work translated into English. I mean, from any language, you know, the figures are very, very low. It's like 3% of literature. Americans don't read literature in translation, blah, 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 blah. It's not available. So, you know, I'm a big advocate of reading in translation. There are also a few Israeli writers who are writing in English, or who have chosen to, interestingly, like publish their books first in English, like thinking about the Edgar Keretz autobiography about his father, which the title of which is now escaping me, but he wrote it in Hebrew. He only writes in Hebrew.
Isn't it 7
Good
years?
Publish it first in English. Yeah, it's, what is it called? It's like
7 Good Years?
Yeah, 7 good. I was going to say 4 years, but I got their number wrong. Yeah, so there, I think, you know, there's a lot of just interesting exchange between language and culture, between Israel and you know, the U.S. or English language literature. Partly because of, you know, the roughly equivalent numbers of Jews in Israel and Jews in the diaspora, right? There's a big, relatively speaking, community of people who are interested in consuming that culture here. Now we know that everybody really likes Israeli TV too, so that would be like another. I mean, I know we're talking about literature. I also write sometimes about film and television, and so. You know, I would actually argue now that TV is maybe the thing that we should be talking about with regard to translation, because that's something that people do watch. There's money in it. It does get imported, unlike literary fiction, which not very much of that is translated. You know, if you turn on Netflix right now, there's like 4 or 5 Israeli TV shows, a couple of which are like very, very good, some of which are okay. but if you but again, the fact that even not great, like okay Israeli TV shows can end up on Netflix, like that in itself is saying something. And I think in a way, like if I had to, I'm a scholar of literature, but like if I had to say like, where is the action at now in terms of Hebrew and Hebrew culture in the US? It's TV.
Well, and it's interesting because in comparative literature, we started saying 10 years ago or so that the future of the literature was really film, that people were going into film studies.
Right.
And that's where the excitement and the creativity, that there was still good literature being written, but either we didn't have a lot to say about it anymore, or there was less to say about it, or it wasn't as exciting as film. And today it's television, and that's amazing. And there are some really wonderful things going on in Israeli TV.
Yeah, and it's accessible. I mean, because I think, Andrew, your question, if I'm not mistaken, is also a little bit about
accessibility.
Yeah, or like what should people be what can people read, or whatever.
But it's also a question about why. If beyond entertainment, why is it? Do you want to know about Hebrew? Do you want to know about Israel? Do you want to know about what's going on in comparative literature?
Right. And again, I mean, I'm sort of a TV partisan at this point, partly because I just like TV, but I like it also from a scholarly point of view. And one of the things that I have really enjoyed about a lot of contemporary Israeli television is that it touches on a lot of those things that you just mentioned. Some of it really takes, you know, as a central issue, the question of language. If you think about Stiesel, for example, and the way that he uses Yiddish. If you think about Arab labor and Arabic, I mean, there's lots of critiques to be made of those shows too, right? But
Arab labor is great.
Yeah, those are two shows just like off the top of my head, and we could come up with more, I'm sure, that where language is like actually a central issue, right? And also the heterogeneity of Israeli culture, which is something we were talking about before in terms of literature, right? With our different backgrounds in terms of what we study. I think you find a lot of that in Israeli TV. And one of the reasons why I feel like the American Jewish community is like so excited to watch Israeli television is partly because of that, is because, you know, the things, this is maybe not so much true anymore, but like the things that got translated into English were like Amos Oz and David Grossman and like these kind of like, and this is not a dig on their literature. They're very important writers and I like their writing, but it's like the old statesmen, and men is men there, of Israeli culture, right? It's the old white men of Israeli culture, not dead white men, because Israel's too young for that. But, you know, we used to say in the 90s, right, talking about identity politics, it was a small slice, you know, and I think there's just a bigger slice available in popular culture, I would say. And so many interesting, weird, crazy, and fun things happening.
So, I mean, I would certainly hop in as well as a lover of cinema and Israeli cinema in particular. That's really quite interesting. And certainly a few of the TV shows that you've surfaced also really connect language with identity. That certain languages are used in certain spaces with certain people. Code switching takes place when you move to a different section. I think it's a tremendously intriguing. I want to share with you a couple questions that have come up from our participants. Zach Mann is kind of curious, what might a homegrown American Hebraist culture look like today? Is there an audience for it? What might be its sort of main formats or genres? And I think tied to this is a question that David Peters asked, which is, Ma kore, or kora, le dovrei ivrit b'tzfon America. What happened to the Hebrew speakers here in America? So is there an audience? What might it look like?
So I think the audience is pretty small. I think that there is one homegrown Hebrew poet, Robert Whitehill Bashan, who wrote a poem just for the book, what we talk about when we talk about Hebrew. He's self-taught Hebraist. And so I don't think there are a lot of homegrown, pure American writers of Hebrew. On the other hand, I think to make this American-Israeli distinction is difficult. There are a lot of Israeli Americans, American Israelis, people who are chetzi, half, people who grew up, maybe they went to high school in Israel, or maybe they went to high school here and they did other schooling. And it becomes less clear and less bifurcated. And so, you know, this is a difficulty with discussing the question, because it's not. And in terms of, you know, makaralanu, well, what happened to us, to the Hebrew speakers? Well, we're here and we're discussing and we're watching Israeli TV.
I guess I like to turn questions around. I probably should have been a therapist, but I guess I'm curious about why that there needs to be an American Hebrew culture.
But why not?
No, I mean, I guess why not, but also why? Like what, I mean, I agree with everything you said, Nancy, and it also goes back to this issue of globalization. Right now, things are a bit more mixed up, and right, you have people moving back and forth, and people who may have grown up in both places or speaking both languages, or we consider themselves both, or like Ruby Namdar, who's lived here for 20 years and he's American and his family's American, and you know, his daughters don't speak Hebrew, but he's a Hebrew writer, and he's very Israeli, but he's also American, and his book is about America, you know. So it really, it blurs a lot of the boundaries. So I guess that's, maybe I'm saying the same thing you are, which is maybe we need to, maybe it's that it'd be more useful for us to think about why are we holding on to those categories when the categories have changed somewhat, right? Or the boundaries between them are not the same.
Well, so you had mentioned earlier Edgar Corrette wrote a book first in English before it was then translated to Hebrew.
No, he did not write the book in English. He writes only in Hebrew. It was translated into English. It was published first in English.
Oh, okay. Published first in English. Okay, so
he did not want it to be published in Hebrew first.
Interesting, because Sigalit Davis asked a question both about Corrette, and also I know Amos Oz and his daughter published a book first on Hebrew language, first in English, and then later, I don't know if one of them was initially writing notes in Hebrew or not, but is that going to be a trend where either more Hebrew writers are publishing in English so that it's a broader audience as part of globalization? They like to write in a different language. And the flip side, is there a concern if there's no American Hebrew writing, will it sustain, or will it be able to engage in a dialogue with Israelis? Like, is this all just a period of lots of change, or is there some intentionality, or should there be some intentionality?
A lot of this is about market forces.
Yeah.
And the Israeli publishing scene has gone through a few upheavals in the past few years. And for the people of the book, there isn't always a lot of support for the book. Plus, you go to Israel and everybody's so busy writing books, I don't know that anybody's reading them anymore. That was a joke. But at any rate, there's also the question of, you know, someone like Shani Boyanju, who writes her first novel in English. And people who choose to write in English is different than choose to publish in English. And sometimes it's like, I'm thinking of Anton Shamas back in the day. In 1986, when he published Arabesques, he said it was because he couldn't write that personal story in Arabic, in his mother tongue. But you have someone like Said Kashua, who writes in Hebrew, in large part because he went to high school in Hebrew, and that's what he's comfortable with.
And his literary touchstones are in Hebrew because of his education. That's, you know, his proof texts are Hebrew proof texts.
Speaking of kind of the learning and how that informs and guides where people go, one of our participants asks, what role can university education play in the future of Hebrew in America? And should resources be directed to point people there? Should resources stay in the sort of K-12 space? There was also Susie Rodenstein wanted to know if either of you, if Jewish camping had been a part of your Hebrew journey. Like, how do we think about all these different pieces?
So first of all, I want to thank the speaker, the questioner that you didn't say the name, for an excellent, excellent question. And yes, university, Hebrew language, learning and teaching. I think there are wonderful things we can do at the university level that cannot be done earlier. Even, I know that the common wisdom is you have to learn a language when you're young. But really, as an adult, you can learn a language in a more cerebral way, and you have more knowledge to hang new language aspects onto, so that the university is a wonderful place to learn Hebrew, and wonderful opportunity. And yes, I think we should direct some resources to university teaching of Hebrew. And I think that's a really excellent question.
And was camp a part of your Hebrew journey?
I did go to camp, yes.
A lot of people have camp on their mind as they're hearing about more and more closings.
Oh yeah.
Melissa, what's your thought about the role of Hebrew at the
Well,
university?
look, like Nancy, I teach in a university, and I have taught language, and so of course I think it's important. And in fact, we often have lots of students who are interested and not enough resources to offer the classes that they want. It's also really hard to find, with the current sort of way things are structured in most universities, it's pretty hard to find instructors who can teach, in the format that's needed, and right, budgets, blah, 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 all the kinds of stuff outside my pay grade. But so short answer, I would agree with Nancy. Yes, like it's a good place to direct resources for sure. And no, I did not go to Jewish camp. I went to wilderness camp where I learned how to portage canoes. If you can believe that, in Minnesota.
Well,
Boundary waters.
Yeah.
With the floods that are happening in parts of the country right now and the dearth of Tarbut Ivrit, you might have made the right choice. I'd love to know a little more about your students, actually, both of you. It's like, what motivates them to sign up to take a Hebrew literature class?
I suspect it's really different for Nancy and for me because Rice has a very small Jewish student population and WashU has a very large Jewish student population. So most of my students are always not Jewish. Mm-hmm. That may not be true for Nancy. I don't know.
It depends, and I don't always know. I always start out not assuming that anyone is. I think the great thing about Hebrew is that it is not purely parochially and narrowly a Jewish language. It is a language, and it has such an amazing backstory in terms of the revival of Hebrew that I think everybody could be interested in it. And I personally think everybody should be interested. And I'm kind of surprised that not everybody at the university is taking Hebrew.
It used to be that you had to, so.
Right, yeah. Right, but we're not at Yale in the 18th century.
I know, well, we wouldn't have been allowed there anyway, Nancy.
Right, but I think that it's so extraordinary to be part of this revival of Hebrew.
Oh, wonderful. Last kind of question. I'm sort of interested. What's kind of your hope for where you think Hebrew might go in this community? Whether it decides that it's going to spend more time learning how to speak Hebrew, or it's going to spend more time engaging with Hebrew literature, either in translation or in the original, or even find ways to create these different types of Hebrew literature that you, in particular, Melissa, spoke of.
I don't know. I think, I guess, I mean, maybe it's obvious from what I've said before, but I guess I think I'd really like people to have a more critical relationship with Hebrew in the US, that is, in terms of thinking about its history and what they've been taught about it. I would love it if people knew more about modern Hebrew. I think a lot of people sort of equate, you know, their liturgical knowledge of liturgical Hebrew with, you know, think of Hebrew as a monolithic entity, I guess. Yeah, I think maybe using Hebrew or learning Hebrew or an engagement with Hebrew, whether that's literature or television or whatever it is, actually. I mean, like, I think we've noted here by now in this conversation that there's lots of different entry points and pathways and ways to engage with Hebrew literature and culture at the current moment. That people would sort of use that engagement as a way of thinking about what they have, their received wisdom about Hebrew in the American Jewish community. I guess that would be my hope, or my hope for the future. Nancy?
Yeah, I don't know that it has to be either Hebrew literature or speaking or anything. I say all of it contributes to the development of Hebrew as one of the most exciting and most expressive and most literary, most elusive of all languages. Elusive with an A and perhaps elusive with an E. And I think I just think it's such a vibrant language, and there's so much that can be done with it. And I love not only its elusiveness, but its generativity. And I don't want to go on and on, but I could. But you might have more questions, or people might actually want.
There actually is a question, I think, prompted by the discussion you were both having about your experiences on campus, and Frida Robbins asked the question about sort of, does some of the phenomena that's happening on some campuses about Israel or anti-Israel activity that's certainly reported about a lot in the Jewish press, is that having any influence on how people think about classes in Hebrew or Hebrew literature? Like, is there a direct relationship between how students are thinking about Israel and how they're thinking about doing your coursework?
No. I mean, that has an easy answer for me. There's nothing really else to say about it.
Yeah, I don't think so. I don't think so. I think it means that sometimes in teaching classes related to Israeli subjects, one needs to be thoughtful, very thoughtful about certain subtopics and ways of presenting it. But I don't think, I agree with Melissa. So, yeah.
Great. I see that somebody also was inspired by the question about camp, and they just wanted to give a quick shout out to a new book that's about to come out on Hebrew at Camp, Hebrew Infusion Language and Community at American Jewish Summer Camps, by Sarah Benor and Jeff Krasner and Sharon Avni. And I'm glad they put the shout out in our Q&A because actually Sharon Avni is one of our conversants next on May 31st for our final Sicha with Avital Cartman. Before we kind of bring it to a close, I'd love to give you each an opportunity to kind of think, reflect back. Is there sort of a key insight or reflection that you have based on our conversation, based on your thinking, based on your work about these sort of ways that Hebrew and culture and identity, literature, all of these things help people make meaning?
Whew, that's a big question.
We can go back to like the learning how to work a canoe. I think it's pretty impressive.
Yeah, I don't know if I remember how to do that, but I did know once. Maybe that's like a lesson about this somehow. I don't know, Nancy, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was thinking about how this conversation started with, in a way, the reason you came to me was because of the book, What We Talk About When We Talk About Hebrew and What It Means to Americans. And yes, I really regret having gave it such a long title. But a lot of these questions come up, especially the question of authenticity and whose Hebrew is it and who gets to claim it. But I was also thinking about the ways in which I have gotten to know Melissa, and that in part because of our experience at one conference in Israel and then another overseas, I asked her to be part of a conference that when we were celebrating Israeli literature at 70. And that's actually the book, since we're plugging books, I'm going to do this, in part because Melissa's essay is so wonderful in it, that's coming out in October. And that's all about Israeli literature at 70 and its real diversity. And it's since 1948, Israeli literature in the making from SUNY. And I hope that book will also spark people's interest in the language as well as in the literature.
Yeah, I actually, just to continue plugging the book, because, but now that you say that, I'm also thinking about the book and the conference that came out of, and realizing that the subjects in the book, right, the articles in the book, and the people who wrote them also touch on almost everything that we've discussed tonight, right? That both in topically, right, in terms of we have people who are writing about Arab Jewish culture and Hebrew literature, Yiddish in Israel. I wrote about alternative homelands in Hebrew literature, and a variety of other things. And then also in terms of who wrote them, right? We had American, native English speakers who study Hebrew literature. We had Israelis living in the United States. We had some Israelis who are living in Israel, right? We had people who were trained here, people who were trained in Israeli universities. In a way, it represents this kind of, mixed up cultural pot that we've been talking about this whole time, both in terms of the subjects that we're writing about and thinking about, and who's doing the writing and thinking. And it also represents the kind of connections and exchange between all of those various cultures and communities also. And then maybe just to wrap up, I can touch on one other thing that Nancy said. She mentioned the word authenticity. And it happens that today I was working on another article that I'm writing about the poet Uri Tzvi Greenberg, who's really known as a great Hebrew poet. But when he first came to Palestine in 1924, he was a Yiddish poet. He was not yet a Hebrew poet. And he wrote a lot about abandoning Yiddish and adopting Hebrew as an authentic literary identity, as an authentic, Jewish identity, leaving behind Europe. But it's very clear in his writing, in the fact that he never really abandoned Yiddish, in the fact that he wrote a lot about how bad a language Hebrew was to write in, and all of these things, that question of authenticity is a lot more complicated than we ever want it to be. And so maybe we could just, that I think maybe is the final takeaway. But Nancy wants to say something else, so it's not.
Yeah, and I just want to say, to make it clear, that the book that's coming out in the fall is also co-edited with Naomi Sokolov. I want to make sure she gets the shout out, because without her, the book wouldn't have happened. So neither.
Thank you for mentioning Nancy's name. You know, I apologize for the horrible rabbinic pun, but it really is a lovely bookends. We began our conversation, Nancy, with a book that you and Naomi put together that led me to start a dialogue with you. And it's lovely that we're also ending with the next book that's coming out that also will include some of Melissa's thinking. This has been an incredibly interesting and intriguing and compelling conversation. And it's great to know that not only is there a lot of vibrancy and diversity in Hebrew literature today, but that it seems like it's moving forward in a very, very powerful way. So thank you both. And I want to turn it back over to Arnie Winchell.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Andrew. And on behalf of Ivrit B'Merkaz, Hebrew at the Center, I want to thank Nancy and Melissa. This was a really stimulating conversation. And all of you who were able to join us tonight and who enriched the evening with your questions and discussion points, I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them because our evening could really go on, our conversation, once we really hit on topics and engage people who are equally engaged in these topics. I want to also extend a special thank you to Alicia Post, who is the program director for the American Zionist Movement, AZM, who from behind the scenes ensured that everything went smoothly. Unfortunately, Facebook streaming didn't work, but we'll have a recording for people who missed this up in a few days. I also hope that many of you will join us for the last Sicha in this series on May 31st at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. As was mentioned, it's with Avital Cartman and Sharon Avni, and they'll be discussing the topic, Reimagining the Future of Hebrew in America. This is co-hosted by the Consortium for Applied Studies in Jewish Education. And if you're interested in some of these topics, they've done some research on their website. There's some research into Hebrew that is up on the CASJE website. For those of you who are Hebrew language educators, we're also hosting a special series, the last of which will be a special workshop for Hebrew department leaders. Hebrew leaders, effective practices and resources, and that's this coming Tuesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. I want to wish everybody a Shabbat Shalom, a Shavuot Sameach in advance, a Laila Tov, and say Rav Todot.